Welcome, everyone. What touching remarks about what you're grateful for. And I am grateful that we have 237 attendees and growing, so this is very exciting. I've been in the field of substance abuse and mental health for 40 years and actually started out working with people with opioid use disorders back when it was primarily heroin. That was in Tampa, Florida. I've now been in all 50 states working with these issues, also 2 U.S. territories, and I'm now working with 160 tribal opioid grantees under a TOR initiative. So I have a lot of experience and a lot to share with you. I'm now with JBS International, and we have a contract to do some technical assistance and training for this initiative. So with that introduction, I'll go ahead and get started. We'll be covering the daily life realities of a parent with an opioid use disorder, OUD. So I'll move through this pretty quickly. We have a lot to cover. You will get copies of all these slides, and all of the slides have notes on them with talking points and with references, and feel free to use these as you can to spread the word. At completion, we hope that you will be able to understand the many pathways associated with developing an opioid use disorder, identify complexities associated with parental or caretaker OUD, and the effects on children, youth, and families, and review just a few common sense and practical solutions to help individuals and families affected by OUD get on a healthy road to recovery. So here's a quote I like to start with. And to see if you can think about who said this. Today feels like a great day to develop an addiction to drugs so bad that I will risk my health, my family, my job, my future, my freedom, and possibly even my life. So you might think about who you think said this quote, and we'll have a little drum roll, and it was no one. Literally no one wishes upon themselves or knowingly goes down a pathway to lead to an opioid use disorder. And I'll clarify that a little more as we go. The pathways to opioid and other substance use are varied and complex. And we will cover, 2 very common pathways during this 1-hour presentation, but there are as many pathways practically as there are individuals. These are very complex illnesses, substance use disorders, and particularly opioid use disorders. And so people end up on these crooked roads, as it were, through a variety of means, and we'll talk about a couple of them. So first, what I'd like to do is start with a quick polling question. Just answer either yes or no, either check or X. How many of you understand how opioid use affects the brain? And I'm just curious to see what we have. And wonderful. Okay, so lots of mixed opinions, but most people appear to be saying either they only have a little bit of experience or that they could certainly learn more, and that's great. I did not, I'm not a doctor, a medical doctor, and I did not stay at a Holiday Inn Express last night, so I'm going to break this down in a very simple way, as simple as possible, to try to explain a very complex brain effect. So you know that that our brain, these are the two graphics or pictures of the brain here. If you look first at the left side, that is what normal activity looks like, and those little blue dots are our body's naturally occurring opioids. We all make an opioid-like chemical called dopamine, and that is something that we have to have in order to survive. It's what gives us joy when we eat good food or have sex or give birth or see our baby, things that, that we enjoy that we need to repeat for survival. And so that chemical is central to survival. And you can see in the left that you have the little blue dots are like your naturally occurring dopamine. and the little Ys are like docking stations. And so those docking stations remain open and receptive to have this normally produced brain chemical called dopamine that is essential for our survival. Then on the right-hand side is somebody who has all of those things, but also is taking external opioids like heroin or pain medications, and those are the little purple dots. And what happens over time is our opioid receptors get confused because now it's being flooded with these external or exogenous opioids, and it doesn't know what to do. Now, the little blue dots are normally occurring dopamine, is something we can never overdose on. It will help us with pain, our naturally occurring opioids, but in very short ways. Like if you twisted your ankle or something, you would have this kind of immediate ability to handle that pain till you could get help or till you could get to a phone, or but it won't help you with long-term chronic pain. It won't help you with a really serious pain, but it does kind of help out in the short term. But over time, our brain gets very confused. Well, why are we having all these external opioids? And so eventually our brain quits making our own naturally occurring dopamine. And so the only way a person that is taking external opioids can feel joy, feel happiness, get a sense of well-being is when they start taking this and rely on these external opioids, because their brain is not producing these natural chemicals anymore. So what happens is we get kind of a hijacking concept here. So the chemical structure is very similar, but these external opioids kind of hijack our brain and basically continues to just flood our brain with these overwhelming amounts of external dopamine. And by the way, the external opioids that individuals are able to get through heroin and pain medications and fentanyl and such are far superior, far greater than what our body normally produces. So it's easy to see how this hijacking process happens. The brain really likes all these high octane, so to speak, outside or exogenous opioids and responds accordingly. So while the initial decision, to use substances of any kind, including opioids, is often voluntary, and I have a big asterisk there, the brain changes that occur over time change a person's self-control and their ability to resist intense impulses, urging them to continue using the substances. So they're really no longer able to really maintain that control, and again, this hijacking situation happens. Now, while the initial decision is often voluntary, it is not always voluntary. In my work across the 50 states and also with many tribal communities, I literally have lost count of the number of children as young as 8 and 10 years of age who never had a choice about their substance use. They were drugged by a parent, by an uncle, by a stepfather, by their mom's boyfriend, or by others in order to control them for sexual abuse and other untoward activities. So sometimes they're forcibly injected, sometimes these drugs are put in their food, sometimes they're coerced into drinking or using a substance, and they find out that if they don't do that, sometimes what they're about to experience is intolerable, so that the only way that they can survive and get through ongoing sexual abuse and trauma is by sort of numbing out, so to speak, through alcohol or other drugs. So we really need to never assume that the person sitting in front of us, that might be our client, has had a choice in their twisted road that they're on substance use. So I'm going to give you two scenarios. These are very brief, and these are just two very common scenarios that we see. One is, let's consider a young girl who's victimized by a perpetrator, say the mom's boyfriend or an uncle, and he may force substances to her to facilitate control or she may, again, learn to take them to necessarily get through the abuse that she will be experiencing, and this can happen to boys as well. And so this is a form of chemical control. Opioids, I know people tend to say, well, one day it's meth and the next day it's opioids and then it'll be another drug. And so these are all kind of the same. And they're really not. They're very distinctive and in some ways good, in some ways bad. The good ways about opioids that make them very different than other substances except alcohol is that we have life-saving medications, incredible, amazing life-saving medications, some that have been studied as many as 40 years, gold standard research. Buprenorphine has 20 years, whereas methadone, 40 years. But either way, lots and lots of years of study. And so there are ways that other substances like meth can be often harder to treat than opioids. We at least have the weapon of really solid medications. But that's the good side. The downside is that opioids are so addicting, and that when someone is addicted, and we'll walk you through kind of a day in the life of a person that has an opioid use disorder, so you'll understand it better if you don't already know, that they can be used to control others. So you will soon see, if you don't already know, that basically a person can become so addicted to opioids, whether it's heroin, whether it's pain medications taken inappropriately and misused, whether it's fentanyl or other kinds of opioids, that basically the person can be controlled. They will do anything if someone is withholding their drug that they need, and they begin to go in withdrawal and begin to get dope sick, they will do just about anything to get access to that drug. So a perpetrator or someone, sex trafficking, lots of different ways that a person can be controlled. And then also you might be familiar with an overdose reversal medication called Narcan, and also called naloxone. But basically you can take an individual who is addicted to opioids, and when they're not in a overdose scenario, you can literally force them into a very painful, difficult overdose. I'm sorry, a difficult withdrawal by giving them this overdose reversal Narcan when they're not overdosing. It makes them extremely sick. So these are two types of chemical control that can happen that don't happen with other substances. So we've got this young girl, she's being sexually abused by her mother's boyfriend or uncle, and what we see in young victims when either they don't come to their parents to get help, or the parent doesn't believe them, or they have their own opioid or other drug addiction and they're connected, is that often the person just gets in a vicious cycle where they then tend to have something we call poly-victimization, which is sort of this cumulative experience. They go from one terrible situation to another. Maybe they run away from home, for example, to get away from the abuse, and now they're living on the street and they have to resort to the only currency they have, which is sex for food or sex for drugs. So, then they end up with a domestic violence relationship when they get their own partner in life. So you tend to see this pattern of poly-victimization that just inflicts incredible trauma, one after another, and the person can see almost no way out whatsoever. So just a quick statistic from the National Center for DV and Trauma. It was a substance use coercion survey, found that about a little more than a fourth of all domestic violence victims reported that this was happening to them, that they either had a partner or ex-partner that had pressured or forced them to get high or drink more than they wanted, or they did it to reduce the pain of what was coming, that they, either the beating or the sexual trauma or other abuse, and that was their way to cope. So invariably, this trauma continues, the opioid use or drug use continues. Opioids can be a very numbing substance, and it's one that victims of violence and including sexual violence can use to escape, and they do it all too often and too well. And so failure to recognize and treat this underlying trauma, or to use stigmatizing language that we even use in some of our substance abuse programs, like asking somebody who comes to our helping services, what is your drug of choice? That's about the most insulting thing we can say to someone who maybe never had a choice, or who had a forced choice, or who maybe, you know, for the next scenario I'll present, really didn't understand what this pathway was leading to. And so, you know, it would be like, and I say this almost jokingly, although it's really no joking matter, if, you know, I've gained weight and I go to my doctor and they tell me, you know, I'm you know, pre-diabetes, or I have diabetes, and they ask me what's my carb of choice, you know, do you like donuts, or do you eat, you know, chocolate cake, or, you know, we don't do that. We don't do that in any helping profession other than in, for some reason, substance abuse. So I would encourage you to really think through some of the language that you're using, maybe because that was how you were taught, and we really need to stop and think about, you know, the message that that sends to someone, that they're choosing this potentially poly-victimization experience that they've had. So another scenario, you can look at the face of this young girl whose mom was just arrested for substance use and taken away in handcuffs, and you can literally see on her face the trauma as she cares for this young barefooted, you know, diapered young child that is her sibling. And this is a wound that is very difficult to heal, and especially when it's compounded by other experiences like living in a home where she may not be exposed to opportunities for health and well-being. So you not only don't have optimal health and well-being opportunities, but now you have these traumatic experiences happening over and over. And obviously children of a parent who has a substance use disorder can have a genetic predisposition. We've learned so much about genetics over the years, and how many, I think there's something like 89 genes that we've now identified that can give you a predisposition to substance use. It's not a death sentence. It's not 100%, oh, you know, you have this in your genetic material, so you're going to become a substance user. It's just, it increases the chances of that happening. But the good news is, if you don't then use substances, then that never kicks in. So at least it does have a prevention element. But I want to think about this young girl. You know, you saw there she was maybe 8 or 10. But as all children develop, addiction is a developmental disease. It starts early. And you can see that literally 67% of all addiction began between the ages of 12 and 17. So you have this young girl or young boy who is growing up in a home, in our second scenario, where the parent is using and there's all kinds of traumatic things happening, and now they become of age where they're likely to experiment in schools. And when they are exposed and choose something to try, whether it's alcohol or another substance, all kinds of bells and whistles will go off in their brain, in their heads, that are very reinforcing if they have the genetic predisposition. Whereas somebody their same age, same weight, same everything else that doesn't have the genetic predisposition may be able to pick up and put down a substance and not even think about it again, not crave it, not have this tremendously reinforcing experience that somebody that has the genetic predisposition would have. So this is a great slide graphic here on the right that shows really the complexity of substance use. This is not specific to opioids, but you've got your biology and genes. Also gender there's some substances are different by gender. You also have mental health disorders that can promote substance use, or that people will try to self-medicate what is a mental health disorder with substances. You've got the environment, the chaotic home environment or abuse, and parents' use and attitudes, peer influences, community attitudes, poor school achievement. These are all environmental factors that can increase substance use. You've got the drug itself, and you see I circled it in red, the effect of the drug, because as I mentioned, opioids can be extremely numbing and can really take the pain away, emotional and physical, and especially for abuse victims. It does have, it's a pain medication for a reason. It's an analgesic, And so people that have a lot of violence in their lives get physical pain relief from the beatings that they're receiving, or the sexual abuse and trauma, the body trauma that they experience, as well as the emotional release of not having to think about all of this when they're high. So it's a very, it's like a lock and key. It's a very powerful substance, opioids. So then you also have the brain mechanisms. Also the route of administration, whether you inject versus smoke, or, all of these factors, how early you're using, how available it is, whether the cost is affordable, or whether you then are exchanging sex for drugs. All of these factors, they're all different for each person, but they all work together to create the scenario that then this person is living. And then, of course, it goes to addiction. So these are complex situations. So going to the second scenario, this young girl, it would be no surprise that she grows up to be a very young mother herself. And here she is overwhelmed. Why? Because what did she see growing up? She didn't have the benefit of well-being, didn't have the benefit of positive parent role models and love and nurturing and that kind of a thing. And there's a very powerful quote from Bill White, who says, effective parenting is contingent upon experiencing the essence of such parenting. Parents cannot authentically give to their children what they have not personally experienced. And this is really something I think we often forget, that when you have years and years of this kind of dysfunction and abuse and neglect and trauma, you don't just pop into a drug treatment program and get over it. You don't just pop into a parenting class and voila, you're back on track. And yet sometimes, especially in the child welfare system, we often have expectations that are not realistic given the degree of circumstances that this person might have endured. So like scenario one, the most common denominator in this scenario two, they share in common is this trauma, which invariably continues, as does the opioid or other drug use, one compounding the other like a vicious cycle. So I want to stop now and ask a quick polling question, yes or no, which is the X or the green check mark. Is the most dangerous time for a child whose parent or caregiver has an opioid use disorder when they are using the opioid in front of the child? So do you think this is the most dangerous time for a child is when their parent is using in front of them, yes or no? Okay, so we see lots of differing responses. I love this. This is just the kind of thing I was hoping, that we have lots of difference of opinions here. And I'm kind of cheating because there really isn't a clear yes or no, but if it's one thing that I hope you can come away with about this section of the presentation today, is that unlike focusing on the use and what that effect has on a child, we want you to take a step back to think about the life in the day of a person that has an opioid use disorder, and what you will see is the incredible volume of opportunities and exposure that can create harm to a child, and that needs to be considered and protected against as we then try to intervene and help with that family. So the examples that I'll provide in the balance of this presentation, they're going to cover several stages: withdrawal, preoccupation, diverted finances and resources, procurement, the buying of the actual opioid, the consumption of it, and then, of course, the exposure of the child. And what you'll see is all of these have their own set of risks that in some cases can actually even be more serious than the actual exposure of the child to the use of what their parent is using in front of them, for example. And so the examples I'm going to give you, by the way, are common to parents or caregivers whose opioid use is not this occasional random use, but actually rises to the level of a diagnosable opioid use disorder, and for someone who is not in treatment. Because if they are in treatment, particularly getting a medication-assisted treatment, a pharmacotherapy, a medication for their opioid use disorder, these kinds of things would not be happening. So this is somebody who's not in treatment. And so while we're not going to cover all of the details that would go with this in this brief 1 hour, that we can at least talk to some extent, we'll cover some of the child safety risks that opioid use can contribute to. So first, a quick reminder, as we know, after an initial pleasurable rush of using opioids, people who use them can be very drowsy for several hours. They can have clouded mental functioning. Repeated use often results in addiction, where seeking and using the drug becomes the primary purpose in life. And you'll see why that is in a few minutes. So first we'll cover withdrawal. And so really the minute a parent or caregiver or individual, even if they're not a parent, that has an OUD, an opioid use disorder, when they wake up in the morning, if they have slept for at least 4 to 6 hours, they are already in pre-withdrawal. And that will go on for many hours. And depending on how often they used, how powerful the opioids are that they're using, and particularly more recently their use, will determine how quickly that withdrawal happens and how discomforting that withdrawal will be. So what I'll describe in a minute is a process that will begin 4 to 6 hours and go on throughout the day. A quick reminder that if there is an intimate partner that has power and control over this individual, those dynamics may be at play, meaning that the individual may wake up and be forced to rely on their very perpetrator for access to their opioids so that they can avoid this terrible withdrawal that people will do just about anything, literally anything, to avoid because it is so uncomfortable. And so the perpetrator can use this as a very powerful chemical control tool. So here is what withdrawal looks like: excessive perspiration, shaking and muscle spasms, severe muscle and bone pain, vomiting, nausea, diarrhea, irritability, insomnia, restlessness, dilated pupils, rapid heart rate, a very creepy anxiety, an anxiety that comes over them that they cannot shake, that is just, mind-numbing, and they just literally want to shake it off, but it won't go away. And as this progresses throughout the day and into the evening and even into the next day, death is not likely, but they generally wish they could die. This is not like, getting the flu, which goes away, at least hey, I've got this, it'll be gone in a few days. This is every day that you go into withdrawal if you don't quickly get to use again. And again, this will different for every person, but if you can imagine, maybe when you were in college or younger and you drank and got really drunk for the first time ever and you were laying on a bathroom floor, like, praying to get away from this and volunteering your firstborn child if somebody would just get you, excuse me, deliver you from this horrible experience. And you do that times 10, that's about what this is like. So this is not just being just a little sick or just a little flu. This is horrific bone pain and all these terrible experiences. So when that parent is beginning, they wake up, and before they even put their feet on the ground, they start to feel that creepy, here it comes, my withdrawal is on the way, I need to take care of this. Are they thinking about and taking care of their child or their children? So depending on how sick they are, and again, in the very first thing in the morning, they might still be able to function and take care of their children, but without opioids as the day wears on, they might be leaving their children in a soiled diaper and in distress. The children may have to take on responsibilities like caring for younger kids that may be beyond their developmental capacity. They may miss daycare or school. And again, the sickness is not going to go away. It goes away literally instantaneously. You can be like on the brink of thinking you're going to die, almost wishing it. And when you take an opioid, it's like it never happened. It's instant relief. But without that, no, it will not go away. So now you've got this parent or this caregiver or this individual who is dope sick. And what is the next stage they go into? They go into preoccupation. And that is, how am I going to get connected to the opioids today? Because these are generally, at least in the public sector, which is where I've dedicated my 40 years of work, the clients that we get in the public sector, this is a great generalization. It's not the case every time, but generally speaking, these individuals don't have a lot of resources. That's why they're in publicly funded care. They don't always have a lot of family members. They don't have necessarily, great jobs and great incomes. They usually arrive to our doorstep when they're pretty much, either arrested or in trouble with child welfare, or they're just really sick and tired of being sick and tired, and they don't have a lot of resources. And so they're not like stashing and rationing opioids. You might remember if you ever smoked pot as a kid, you have your little stash. I've read that it's kept in a dresser drawer somewhere, so your parents wouldn't see it when you're a kid. You have a stash that you're holding on to for the weekend or what have you. But that is rarely the case with opioids because there is no ability to stash. Usually you'll use what you have when you have it. So this is often, for many parents, many individuals, literally a daily scramble to get the opioids every time. And maybe they'll get them for a day or two, but generally that means they are calling their dealer or trying to get, hooked up with their dealer to get their opioids. Well, you got to think about this. If they owe the dealer any money, that dealer's not going to call them back right away. They'll let them literally sweat a bit. If the dealer got put in jail or, ran out or doesn't have, they're not going to get a call back. They're frantically trying to come up with their replacement opioids for that day. And so what is happening when this is going on, are they taking care of their kids, when they're preoccupied? And this is an actual quote of somebody in preoccupation. I blame for my caseworker, I blame the long hours at my job, for my strange sleeping patterns and my frequent absences. I have no job. I am just always on the hunt for more heroin. My opioid addiction has taken me over. My life is broken down into 4 to 5 hour increments to get high to put off feeling sick. This is not like, oh, great, I can't wait to have fun and get high. This is, I can't be dope sick anymore. What do I have to do to make that go away? So while they're obsessing and preoccupied with their next connection, meanwhile, the child may have untreated ear infections or other ailments that goes unnoticed or unattended to by the caregiver. They may be left in front of a TV or a computer or YouTubing for the day while their caregiver is working to get their connection to their opioids. They may be at higher vulnerability to common dangers in the home like hot stoves or steep chairs or stairs or choking hazards and heavy dressers because the caregiver is distracted. And if the child is older, they may be pledged into service to try to contact the drug dealer on behalf of their parent or caregiver to satisfy that caregiving need, their caregiver's need for opioids. And so while the parent is preoccupied, then the child may not be getting that healthy attachment with their parent. And so, at worst, they're getting abused and neglected potentially, at best, they're being neglected. At worst, they're being, physically abused or otherwise in trouble because the parent cannot think about anything else. So this missed opportunities for fostering healthy attachment. Parents and caregivers with significant opioid-seeking preoccupation will have this less interaction with their child typically, and this chronic neglect can lead to persistent activation of the stress response systems, which we call toxic stress, in a young child that affects the architecture of their brain. So if this happens over time, the brain of a young child is being rewired and they're missing opportunities to bond and to learn and to meet developmental milestones because they're spending a lot of time being, in this toxic stress situation where they're not being responded to, their cries are going unnoticed and unattended to. And again, this is not every parent every time. This is the range of things that can happen depending on how bad the addiction is and what other circumstances, and whether or not they have any helping support in the home. Maybe they might have some family member or maybe a non-addicted partner who can step in and help. So we don't want to always assume the worst, but you need to know that these are the things that can be happening every day in these families. I don't have time to go into all the effects if the woman is pregnant. That could be its own webinar because there are a lot, but I've worked a couple in just to give you some examples here. So if a pregnant woman is using opioids, her opioid-seeking behavior in fear of drug testing may result in avoidance of her personal health care and prenatal care, and that can contribute to malnutrition and adverse fetal development. This happens all the time. There is probably no disorder on planet Earth that is more stigmatizing than opioid use disorder, except if it's a pregnant woman who has an opioid use disorder. This is a very stigmatizing condition, and so these pregnant women will often, if they even know they're pregnant, will often avoid any kind of personal health care or prenatal care for fear of how they will be judged and looked at or discovered, or fear that their baby will be taken away. So now we've covered the withdrawal, we've covered the preoccupation, but then we have diverted finances because these opioids are not free. So one quote, "I need heroin to feel normal. I don't love anymore. Now I'm sick. I can't afford the heroin that I need. How did $10 used to get me high? Now I need 100. So as their tolerance increases, they need more and more and more opioids just to avoid getting sick. Again, not to really get high. They might have a minute or two of fun, but it's mostly just to avoid being sick. And so that costs more, and so they have to pay more, whether they use, like I said, their own body for currency or whether they're diverting finances. And you'll see this happen over time if you do child welfare work, that, you know, pretty soon when you're doing home visits, if there's an opioid use disorder, things will start disappearing. You know, the furniture, the stereo, the TV, they're pawning these things off. Then pretty soon the kids' computer system goes away. You know, and the kids' toys are being sold and traded. And so, or often the person will become a drug dealer themselves in order to obtain the drugs. So parents who use opioids multiple times a day, they're often unable to maintain employment because this gets very disruptive when they're having to use every few hours and do it in a way that they can't be caught or detected. So then how does that happen, and how do they maintain employment? And then if they don't have a job, then how do they pay for this constant need? And so they may end up sofa surfing, going from one place to another, you know, dragging their child or their kids with them because they don't have stable housing, and they just end up, you know, everywhere. So the caregiver diverts finances. Meanwhile, the child may have inadequate food, poor nutrition, lack of medical treatment, or safe housing. They may be exposed to a chaotic lifestyle, these frequent moves to keep ahead of being evicted all the time, being temporarily placed with various family members and in or out of different daycare centers. And when that happens, there's no baseline. When a child is going in and out of every red roof daycare inn from one place to another, then it's harder for the daycare center to detect if certain milestones aren't being met or if certain things are happening in the home. They won't know, is this child, you know, behaving differently today than last week if they're in constant turmoil and going from one daycare to another. So it also makes it harder for them to bond with these helping resources. The children don't get the full benefit. So also, if the parent or caregivers or the person is diverting finances, the children may experience a loss of family and other supportive relationships, because often these individuals will steal from their own parents, their own friends, because this addiction is so compelling and all-consuming, it has to be fed. And so they'll steal, and pretty soon the family won't let them come around anymore. And so the children often are the ones that lose that important family connection. That might be the only stable connection they have, and it causes this estrangement from individuals who were once supportive. And this can lead to chronic anxiety in these children and hypervigilance, and can contribute to developmental and cognitive delays. Also, if they're diverting finances, the children can be exploited for financial or sexual purposes. So now we move from diverting the finances to, let's say we now have the money to purchase the opioid. How does that go down, since this is being done often every day or multiple times a day? So this takes considerable time, commitment, and risk to be able to procure, you know, to go into a community. So it's rarely timely. If the dealer says, you know, I'll meet you on the corner of broad and, time, then you get there and they tell you they'll meet you at 3 o'clock. You might be 3:30, 4 o'clock. They know you're going to be there because they know you're sick if you don't get it. And so you'll wait. And so this might take a lot longer than you think. Procurement might occur in neighborhoods that are unsafe. The person dealing the drugs may be unsafe. And so also when you're procuring, unbeknownst to you, fentanyl could be, only takes a couple grains, almost of grains of salt is what it looks like of fentanyl that can cause an overdose. And so that could be unknowingly included in the opioid substance that you're buying on the street. And so this procurement process is fraught with all kinds of dangers and risks. And so here's another quote from a client. I grab my keys, I head to my car. I throw my kid in the back seat, and off I go to the neighborhood I usually cop in. The drive always feels longer than it is when your withdrawals are kicking in again. I call my dealer. He says it's going to be 10 minutes, which I know isn't true. I'm looking at least 45 minutes to an hour. I check my phone waiting for him to call. I'm starting to get dope sick again. So this is a very anxiety-producing phase in the daily life of an opioid user. And so what are they doing? If they have children, are they throwing the kids in the car seats and off they go? And now the kids are exposed to all these dangers? Are they having the dealer come to them? And then do you have unsafe people in the home where these children are? Are these unsafe people coming into the home making mental notes of, well, how old are these children, and how might they be useful to the dealer in other untoward ways? So this whole procurement process is fraught with danger. And also remember that once somebody procures, if they are dope sick, they may use right then. So if they drove themselves with the kids in the car seat to the dealer, then they might use right then. And so now they're driving while they're nodding off, or while they're, not either they're dope sick and they might not be able to drive easily and carefully, and they might be taking chances, or they might be, they might use instantly when they get it and then nod off and, be parked on the side of the road or parked at a traffic light and not even be aware that they're nodding off and they got kids in the back seat. So either way, these are not good scenarios. So while this procurement is going on, the child may be left with unknown or unsafe caregivers. They may be left alone. The parent may think, oh, I'm going to be popped down to the corner for 10 minutes, they'll be fine, and it ends up being an hour or two. They may be strapped in a car seat for hours or days at a time and potentially exposed to unsafe people while caregiver is procuring. They may witness the caregiver's frantic attempts to procure or steal opioids. And, these kids pick up like radar of this kind of frantic, desperate nature of somebody who is their parent or caregiver who they can tell is in distress. They may be at risk for car-related injuries, fatalities if the caregiver uses right after procurement and has an accident due to their intoxicated state, or leaves the child in a car exposed to extreme temperatures. And if they're older, the kid may be asked to drive the caregiver or the parent to obtain opioids in an unsafe location. So now, finally, we are at the last stage, which is where I began asking you, do you think that the actual use is the dangerous part? And you can clearly see that at all these stages in the daily life of an opioid user, they're fraught with potential risks and danger. And yet now we're at the point where they're actually using. And so it's hard to say any of these are more dangerous than the others. They're really all potentially dangerous. So depending on the type, strength, and amount of the opioids consumed, the duration of the parent's high can vary considerably in the length of time and the severity and the extent of their associated behaviors, like nodding out, like being disoriented. And their overdose risk may be present. Again, they don't know unless they have a fentanyl testing strip that fentanyl could be in that, and that use could be their last. They could overdose, or, and that doesn't mean they'll necessarily die, but many do. And so, and it has happened, I'm sure you've read, of parents who have overdosed with an infant in the house, and because they were estranged from family and friends, all of them perished. The adults, both shot up heroin with fentanyl in it. They overdosed, and the baby died of of not having food and water, and that has played out across the country, not often, thankfully, but it has happened. And so there's also risk for contracting infectious diseases like HIV or hepatitis, particularly if they're injecting. And then also through infected injection equipment or through unprotected sex with an infected person. So, the risk for these other contagious diseases is there. So for the opioid consumption, a quote, "My dealer gives me what I need. Now I need to find a good bathroom. I can't wait to get home to use. I find one of my favorites. Single stalls give you more privacy and time. I park out front, walk straight to the back where the bathrooms are. I'm obsessed with the ritual of shooting up, the water, the mixing, the pop of my vein when the needle goes in. I release the belt, the heroin floods my brain. Wandering back out to my car, I get some looks from customers like they know, but I really don't care." So this, you can just see in this quote, this literal obsession and with, having to do this and the ability to not wait because they're sick. And so they need to use. So when all this is happening, when the opioids are being misused, whether it's heroin or misuse of pain meds, the kids may not be able to wake the caregiver or the parent, or they may witness an overdose, even a fatal one. They may go without basic care like diaper changes, baths, or appropriate meals for hours or days. They may not have a safe sleep environment. They may be co-sleeping with the parent. There may be loose blankets in the crib, unrelated men in the home. And if older, they may misuse the opioids themselves with or without a caregiver's permission. And, they could come across the needle that could be infected with HIV or Hep C or something like that. Other consumption factors, parents and caregivers who use opioids multiple times daily often lack hunger and the cues that let them know they're hungry and time to eat. So they may not have an appetite, and that may relate to inconsistent meal schedules for their child. A parent or caregiver that's high on opioids may have reduced parental capacity to respond to a child's other cues and needs. And if the older children are observing this behavior, then they become aware of the parental opioid use. They may normalize this and think that this is, what happens in families, and it may contribute to their own access or the environmental reinforcement that contributes to their future use. So parents and caregivers may have difficulty regulating their emotions, contributing to physical or emotional abuse of children or other family members. They're on this kind of roller coaster up and down. And I've already explained that, the exposure to the kids of either the infectious diseases on contaminated needles or syringes. Also, syringes often have a tiny little cap at the end, real small, and it's usually bright orange, like glow-in-the-dark orange or white. But anyway, the kids can swallow them. They're often littered under sofa cushions or under tables, wherever the injection is happening if they're taking it by that method. Also, some of these pain meds that might be being taken can look like candy to children. They're colorful, and so if they're left out, on a table, and especially if the parent nods off after they first use, then the child can have access to these. Children, if the parents are smoking the opioids, they're much more, the children are more susceptible and affected by the secondhand smoke. And so that can experience kind of a contact high if it's a small enclosed area like a car or a small room, and can contribute to asthma and respiratory problems. And then also if a parent is injecting and they use like a belt or laces or plastic tubing to tie off on their arm while they inject, that can pose a strangulation hazard to the parent. So I want to stop here and have you put in the chat box WWYW. So what would you want if you were one of these parents of, let's say, the two scenarios that we presented earlier, and you are absolutely broke financially and you're broken personally, you're exhausted, you're traumatized, you're scared, you're sick and tired of being sick and tired, you're homeless, or every day's a new adventure where you're going to live, on whose sofa, you're unemployed or you're underemployed, you don't have any transportation, you're a parent or a caregiver, you have all the stresses of children, and you have clouded mental functioning, so you're not thinking clearly. And you have all these, keep in mind that people with opioid use disorders, rarely is that their only problem, their only challenge. They have lots of other, they're usually involved with the criminal justice system and court and child welfare, and they might have a probation officer, and they have, maybe they're dealing with a couple different fathers, of their child, and dealing with all this chaos. What would you want if you were that person when you came in touch with a helping professional? And you're giving some incredible responses here. You want people that won't judge you, that will support, love. You want someone who understands. This is so true. This gentleness with an open heart, help, guidance. And sadly, rarely do you get that. And maybe in the programs that you're associated with, but again, I've been in all 50 states, 2 U.S. territories, and working with, a lot of tribal communities, and unfortunately, this is not always the case. So this is often what they get. They get this quite complicated process of how to get into recovery, to get into a treatment program. Either there's a waiting list, or there's very bureaucratic processes they have to navigate when they have clouded mental functioning, no money, no safe place to live, no transportation, or it's of too short duration to line up with the degree of severity that they have, or it's too low intensity, it's just not in depth enough, or it's not evidence-based, or they have policies that do crazy things like kick a person out when they came there for help because they return to use and have a positive drug test, and none of us would ever get kicked out of a diabetes program. Our physician wouldn't say, wow, you must have been eating some white bread here because your numbers are up, so I'm done treating you, you're out, I'm kicking you out of this program. This doesn't happen. We don't do this anywhere except in substance abuse treatment, and we're getting better about that, but literally less than 30 days ago, maybe 45 days actually, I heard a true story of a young man who came every single day to a methadone program without fail, and he had a positive cannabis test and he was kicked out. And you think, oh my word, isn't there any other way that you could treat this therapeutically, or to find out, well, why did you get high, and maybe there were reasons, like he was a veteran and he wasn't able to sleep and he had post-traumatic stress and he was finding some comfort in that, and maybe there's a healthier way we could help him, but kicking them out. And then the worst part was, and I'll never forget this as long as I live, that the person, they said, oh, hopefully he'll be back, but he's very low functioning, he has a very low IQ, and he was on the autism spectrum, but he also had, like, I think they said a 50 or 60 IQ. So he had a massive disability. And to take somebody who with that disability managed every single day to show up for a medication-assisted treatment to be kicked out, 45, it's just, we can and must do better. So policies and practices are also big barriers here. Or we get this fun-filled little retort when we call a program. You could be homeless, have a criminal justice history, be a DV survivor, have all these things going on, and be told, oh, don't worry, we can squeeze you in about 2 weeks. We can squeeze you in every Wednesday from 3 to 4. So, this is just, again, not when you're ready to come in, you need to be able to get in then. And so I want to ask real quick, because we're getting close to time, and I'll finish up real quick here, but can you tell me, yes or no, have any of you experienced having this happen for clients that you try to get into treatment, that either that they can't get in because it's so bureaucratic and there's all these problems, or they get kicked out for minor infractions that should be dealt with in therapeutic ways, or that it's just too low of a threshold and they can't get in for weeks, and have these things happen. So good, I'm seeing some no's, but a lot of yeses, and that should just never happen if you ever try to get somebody in, and that's a problem we need to work on. This is a tremendous quote from Bill White. We are routinely placing individuals with high problem severity, complexity, and chronicity in treatment modalities whose low intensity and short duration offer little realistic hope for successful post-treatment recovery maintenance. And for those with the most severe problems and the least recovery capital, this expectation is not a chance, but a setup for failure, a systems failure marked as personal failure. So this is unfortunately something I've seen for 40 years. We are getting better, but this still happens in far too many places. Brain rebalancing takes time. If you're able to get individuals on medication-assisted treatment, you probably noticed how almost before your eyes, within a matter of days, they look so much healthier, so much better, so awesome that they can go, you know, these medications are miraculous almost. But that doesn't take away all the trauma. It doesn't take away all the bonding that didn't happen with their children. It doesn't take away, you know, the skills that they don't have. You know, it doesn't give them the skills. It takes time for them to be on medication-assisted treatment or to be in an opioid use disorder program before all of these, just remember the crooked road they were on. It doesn't straighten out overnight. And so while it's important to get parents into life-saving treatment, by itself it will not address the harms of these young children. They need evidence-based parenting programs. They need programs that can heal that parent-child relationship. Very interesting here. There are a number of, you know, we used to put parents like these in skills-based training, and that's okay. That's important because a lot of these parents didn't get the skills themselves when they were growing up. However, the attachment-based parenting interventions, like ones that you get with child-parent psychotherapy or parent-child interaction therapy, or nurturing parenting program, or parents and infants interacting with infants, PIWI. These programs not only are showing tremendous promise with opioid-addicted parents, but when I started out with the brain science about how you get that dopamine, that positive reinforcement, life-saving reinforcement of the positive opioid chemicals in our brain, that those are reinforced through these attachment programs that maybe are not happening with the skill-based. So an added bonus there, which is incredible to be able to get. This is one of just the child-parent psychotherapy, but I just mentioned 3 or 4 others, and you can play this back and get the names of those if you didn't write them down. But that bonding opportunity is really key. So to thrive in the face of adversity, it's often the presence of at least one stable and committed relationship with a supportive parent, a caregiver, or other adult. And we really, whether that's a peer recovery support person, we know how important that is to have, and it's helpful for the children as well. We need the non-stigmatizing, non-judgmental approaches. Shame is such a significant barrier, and we just need to recognize these difficult pathways that these families are on. We need to have a trauma-informed family service plan, one plan that looks at the whole family, not just the parent, not just the kids, and that it should be trauma-informed and employ evidence-based services. Ironically, these 3 things here, CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, say every child relationship and environment should have. And I would argue that this is also needed for the parent. It should be safe, free from fear, secure from physical or emotional harm. It should be stable, predictable, with consistency in relationships, with routines and people and places, and nurturing. And so these are 3 really key ingredients. I do want to say real quick, and I know we're just down to a couple of slides left, I want to say that even though we presented all the risks of a parent with an opioid use disorder, there are parents with protective capacities and have incredible ability to attempt to safely parent their children when they are opioid users. One example was a young woman who came to me in her 30s who told me when she took the same training I'm giving you now that she realizes that her father had an opioid use disorder, and that he was a construction worker and he had an accident and then he got addicted to painkillers. And when the doctor quit prescribing him, he started getting heroin off the street, and her mom had to work at night as a nurse to be so that they could get extra money from the night shift. So the dad would literally load her up in the car to go procure every night to the dope house. But he told her he was going to play cards, and he locked her in the car for her own safety. He gave her food, a pillow, a backpack, a blanket. He would come check on her every couple hours. He locked her in for her safety. There are parents, despite these terrible pathways they're on, often take incredible heroic measures to the best that they can, to the best of their ability to be a good parent. They just need a lot of help and support. She said he was the only parent that made tree forts with her. All her fond memories were with her dad, only because her mom was the one working at night. But anyway, so we don't want to assume that they're all bad parents. They're not. They're parents stuck in really bad circumstances that they don't want to be in any more than the children do. There are early steps in home visitation programs that can help these kids catch up on their developmental milestones, and a lot of these programs will come into the home. Early Head Start programs that can provide stable, nurturing relationships and supports. And they can also meet regularly to check in with the parents and anticipate the kind of supports the parents will need to help them be healthy and stable as well. So this opioid use disorder, it sends ripples through families and communities. Even if you stopped it today, these ripples will have long-lasting consequences, and especially if they're ignored. So we're so appreciative of all the work that you are doing. You have the opportunity to be that pebble in the pond that creates the ripple for positive change. And so I thank you for all the work that you're doing and for the children and parents who are entrusted to your care, and hope that you can help them make a better future than their past, and they deserve nothing less. I'm just going to show you real quick the resources that you have, just so you know what's here. This is hot off the press. The SAMHSA Tip 63 update version came out yesterday. There's been a one up above that's been there a long time, but now it's been updated. I provide the link to that. Oh, by the way, also a cool executive summary here to the left that can let you know, the Reader's Digest Cliff Notes version, and also this very updated Tip 63 will show you what was changed. If you're already familiar with the old one, you can do a cheat sheet and see what was changed. This is a phenomenal document with lots of tear out hints and tips and fact sheets and things for pregnant and parenting women. Here's one for opioid crisis in the African American community. This came out just in the last month, I believe. This is an oldie but goodie, pregnant women with OUD. This is a very cool resource developed by the National Center on Substance Abuse and Child Welfare. They're a tremendous group that has wonderful resources available, particularly around collaborative practice. And this right here, this document, if you have a lot of pushback from people in the community that don't believe in medication-assisted treatment and have some misinformation, this one will give you some really good ammunition, as will this one from the Legal Action Center, Myths and Facts. These are all public domain. You can print them out. You can use the information in fact sheets. And then, of course, all your references for everything that I've talked to you about is here. So we'll have, I'll stay on. I know we're 6 minutes beyond schedule, but if you have questions, and I have to admit I might not be as good as seeing them in the chat box, but I don't know, Jason, if you can help me out here, if you see any that, and thank you for your kind words here. I'm seeing all these wonderful comments. Thank you so much. But I'm happy to answer any questions you might have, and feel free to use these materials as you want, because that's why we create them, so that you can cut and paste them, make them your own, do whatever you want. Just please cite the references and go forth and do good things. So if there's any questions where we can get the materials, I believe the materials will be on this website within a few days. Jason, can you let me know if that's the case?
So this is Susan. Yes, we will be sending out the recording and the slides in a few days after this presentation. And folks, please go ahead and enter your questions in that chat box. I'm also going to ask Jason to launch the exit poll just so it's here for those of you who have to leave. And while you are typing your questions, a few questions came in during the presentation that we can start with. The first, Pam, early on you said that people should not use the language drug of choice. What language would you suggest that people use instead of that?
Excellent question. What is the primary drug you use? Or if any drug that you are interested in is available, what is your go-to? If you're trying to find out what's the primary drug you use, the secondary drug, there's no reason to just use the word choice. Same thing and I do a webinar on language if you ever want that one, and I have some cool handouts for that, where we kind of walk through the old dated language and the new language, and even things like, you don't want to say somebody has a dirty urine or a dirty drug screen or they tested dirty. Individuals, particularly women and particularly individuals who have been sexually abused or sex trafficked, feel dirty already. And so when you then use that word like dirty, or that you're clean or dirty, or how much clean time do you have? It's very stigmatizing. And one of my favorite clients of all time told me that she went to treatment 11 times, and 11 times it didn't work, she didn't feel comfortable, she felt judged, she didn't get anything that helped her. And the 11th time she actually went to a faith-based provider, and that the very first thing the person did when they saw her knock at the door is they came and hugged her. And she had just had sex with 8 different men to support, at that time, a crack habit. And she said, you can't imagine what it was like to feel dirty and nasty and to have the smell of 8 men literally on me, and to have somebody who hugged me and who said, come in, let's get you a shower, let's lie down, take a nap, get a good night's sleep. We'll talk in the morning and we'll see how we can help you. And she said that bed, even though what she got from the faith provider was not as sophisticated in terms of the clinical practices, she did have to go elsewhere for those. She said she finally felt worthy of treatment for the first time in 11 attempts. So these words are powerful, and we don't mean harm when we say them, but this is how it's interpreted often by the people who come to us for help.
Well, Pam, I know that people who are watching this webinar would appreciate a link to a document about language. We did have several comments about that indicated people were interested in the kind of language they should be using.
Oh, sure.
Another question that came in earlier, when you were talking about toxic stress and the changes to the developing child's brain architecture, what ages are we talking about when we use the term young child in that circumstance?
0 to 3 being the more profound time frame, but I believe it can go, even later, maybe even 0 to 5. But if you've ever been on a webinar about toxic stress, or if you can even Google you can see a video clip of the brain pathways, the neural pathways being developed very rapidly. Like millions of these little pathways are being developed when a child is getting proper stimulation and give and take, and for those neural pathways to develop. And if they are literally stuck in a crib and no one comes, they know when they cry it doesn't do any good because nothing changes, and they're not getting that give and take and that stimulation that they would get if there was good parental interaction, those neural pathways then don't develop. And so that architecture of the brain is compromised. Now, the good news is it can rapidly make up for some of the lost time if the child is attended to very quickly and early. The earlier the children can be identified and come in to get, work with these developmental milestones, the better. But if years tick by and they're just literally left, unattended in a crib or a playpen or something, and they're just not given opportunities for those neural pathways to develop, it can have very long-term harmful consequences to the architecture of their developing brains.
Pam, we have had quite a few expressions of dismay about the lack of services and response in people's home communities. Is there anything you can tell us about the work that's being done through OVC and BJA grantees around the country?
Yes, so not as much detail as somebody who works primarily in that portfolio, but what I know is that there's tremendous collaborative practice happening with the OVC BJA grantees that recognizes that no one can serve a family like we're describing today by themselves in a vacuum. That the abuse, the neglect, the maltreatment, the toxic stress, the developmental issues with children, the domestic violence, the trauma, you know, the basic economic assistance, the need for job skills and development, the need for peer mentors and, you know, somebody who has walked in the road to recovery that can help somebody, give them hope, which, you know, is a free service. Getting hope is just very key and very necessary. To also have the kind of recovery support that someone needs to be able to get help, for all of these systems that are concurrently working with these clients to work together to leverage each other's resources so that we're not leaving gaping holes in one place and all piled up, you know, doing duplication of services in another. And so that's one of the common denominators. You know, all the work of these grantees varies by where they're located, but they share a common denominator of this collaborative practice expectation. And only, I think, when that happens can these evolutions in practice that really need to happen occur. Because really, in my experience of 40 years, some of the best work we've done in addiction treatment didn't evolve by ourselves, but evolved because we were being beat up by our child welfare partners saying, listen, you guys cannot be, you know, I get somebody to treatment and you can't let them out because they manifested their disease that you yourself say is chronic and relapsing. You know, you can't be kicking these people out because then I have to take their children away, or I have to remove, you know, terminate their parental rights. So much is at stake. We need you to up your game. I mean, I'm sorry, I'm being a little, you know, shortcutting here. But anyway, it's the pressure from other systems to look at different ways to configure our systems and to have better policies and practices. And really, some of these funding opportunities, like from OVC and BJA, allow these communities to try some of these innovative best practices and to develop ways to sustain them, that if those grants and those funds weren't available, they would never happen. So the key word here is how to keep these sustained, how to do these collaborative, multi-system, multi-sector practices to work collaboratively and to sustain these practices, find out ways that they can be billable, find ways that you can work together, you know, in ways. I mean, I probably ran the most successful program in the country that served entire families, 100 people at any given time. We admitted entire families, didn't matter how many kids. We didn't have you choose between your recovery and your children. We didn't have you choose between your recovery and some of your children. Like, oh, you can bring the 10-year-olds and under, but the 13-year-old can't come. We said, come as you are, come as many as you are. And we served entire families using a very innovative public housing infrastructure. We ran the program as cheap as an outpatient, standard outpatient model would be. We were able to bill Medicaid because the clients were able to pay rent through subsidized housing vouchers. And, you know, and so these, by partnering, these, you can do incredible. We had some of the highest success rates in the country, even 5 years. We had something like an 82% sustained recovery rate 5 years later, and this was 20 years ago. So, you know, and that was in a rural community of Key West, Florida, a 2-by-5 mile island that had very little social service money, lots of money for tourism, but no money for social services. So this can be done, and it just requires a will, requires some collaborative practice, requires creativity, and often some startup funding, like, you know, is being provided by BJA and OVC with lots of training and technical assistance support.
Well, thank you, Pam. I think this is a good place to end on a high note, a note of hope that there is work being done. People are struggling to come together and build cross-system collaborations. Clearly, from the comments, our participants really have appreciated this webinar. One more time, folks, you will all be receiving a link to the recording, a set of the slides, and links to some additional resources. So that's it for the questions. Pam, thank you so much for your time today.
My pleasure, and thank you all for participating. Stay safe.
Goodbye, everyone.